No more Mr. Nice Guy. Hello, my name is Will, and this is Exploding Helicopter, the podcast that you wish would disintegrate after 99 minutes. Now, what do you call a comic book adaptation when it's not a comic book adaptation? Well, you wouldn't go wrong calling it Darkman. Unable to secure the rights to Batman or The Shadow, Sam Raimi decided to create his own avenging hero with a secret identity. And so was born Darkman, the horribly scarred star of the movie we're reviewing on this show. To help me review the film, I'm joined by a man who's a hideous vision of his former self. He's half man, half freak. It's Doug Tilley from Cinema Smorgasbord. Welcome back to the show, Doug.
Oh, what an intro. I mean, incredibly accurate, certainly in the year 2020. But yes, thank you. Thank you for having me back. You know, not that the film that we covered on the last time that I guessed it was a bad film necessarily. It wasn't that great. It maybe didn't have the profile, at least for some audiences, as Darkman.
Well, you did rather shame me in getting you back onto the show. You called me out on the internet about it, and yeah, I mean, I do appreciate it. It's generally very exciting to be a guest on somebody else's podcast, and yeah, I did make you sit through a faith-based martial arts movie, so I can imagine your disappointment the last time you were on my show.
I mean, I make people sit through movies that they obviously don't want to watch all the time. So I know exactly the situation that you're in, but I feel like I'm in a lot more comfortable territory here.
Well, that's good. And yeah, that's primarily one of the reasons why I wanted to get you back for this particular show, because I know that you are a fan of this film's creator, Sam Raimi. I must confess that I think Darkman is the only film of his that I've seen. I'm not particularly big on the horror genre, and I'm not that big on the sort of superhero genre either. So yeah. You know, as somebody who's really only seen one of his films, you know, what is it about Sam Raimi that, you know, I should care about, and why should I sort of get a bit deeper into his work?
Well, your mileage may vary, but but when it comes to Sam Raimi, I have to be honest. I think thinking back now, particularly to the really formative period when I'm getting interested in films, and particularly filmmaking and the process of filmmaking in the early 90s, Sam Raimi was the director who got me there, who got me interested, who got me fascinated. And that was almost entirely it. Actually, I came from a kind of a strange perspective, because I saw Army of Darkness when it came out in 1992, which is the third Evil Dead movie. I'm sure a lot of people listening already know that. But I, maybe one of the few people on this planet, didn't realize it was a sequel because of the title. And I saw it and I was like, this is just a very strange film. And then I discovered afterwards that it had two films preceding it. And unlike, I think, a lot of people, though I do find more and more people in this category because I speak to a lot of low-budget filmmakers. The first film, the original Evil Dead, was the film that really inspired me as both someone who was interested in the filmmaking process and also interested in making films myself, because it really kind of reinforced this idea that any group of people could get together and make a movie, get it distributed, get it out into the world. And my current and ongoing interest in sort of micro-budget and shot-on-video cinema, really the starting point was with The Evil Dead. So Sam Raimi is a director that I always felt kind of a kinship with, but also seeing the development of his career from that point, from someone making independent films, having failures, and then kind of breaking through to a sort of mainstream audience with Darkman, and eventually finding huge Hollywood success. It's been a real interesting ride being a fan of this man's career. It is really interesting. You might be in a very kind of unique category because of specifically not having interest in those two genres that you've skipped out on a lot of his career. If you have some interest in baseball, then that's the third part of his career that you probably have no interest in.
I can't say I'm too interested in baseball either. So I mean, it's becoming more and more apparent to me exactly why Sam Raimi is such a black spot on my film watching CV.
I mean, look, one of the questions you just asked was why you might be interested in Sam Raimi outside of the idea that he started from this very low budget place, working with the Coen brothers, and you know them all actually living together at some point. Of course, Frances McDormand is even in this film, and they were all part of this kind of collective in the 1980s that eventually led to Blood Simple, and of course the rest of the Coen brothers' career, which ended up with them actually working together in the Hudsucker Proxy just a few years after Darkman. It's interesting watching where their careers have gone and the critical acclaim that that the Coen brothers have received, while Sam Raimi has gone into kind of a more commercial direction, that they both kind of started, or all I should say, started in the same place. But the thing that I think really typifies a Sam Raimi movie is the wild visual style of those movies, and you see it on display certainly in Darkman. This is a movie that takes that really clearly, obviously, was influenced by the Tim Burton Batman movie that came out the year before, but it goes into real wilder, campy, I would say, very extreme territory very quickly in the movie itself, and that is reflected in the performances, but certainly in the camera work.
So if I wanted to continue my Sam Raimi education, can you give me a couple of recommendations of maybe where I should go next?
Well, I mean, the obvious place would be the Evil Dead films, Evil Dead 1, Evil Dead 2. And Evil Dead 1 is much more of a traditional horror movie that is extremely violent. Evil Dead 2 is much more of a comedic horror film, while Army of Darkness is kind of a straight action adventure movie with some horror elements. So really, even though those are not really genres or a genre that you're particularly interested in, the variations on that genre keep it very interesting. But if you want to move outside of that, certainly the second Spider-Man movie, I think, even if you're not interested in superhero movies, which I know you are not, is considered one of the high points of that entire genre, and I would agree with that. His return to horror from, well, now it's been quite a few years back, Drag Me to Hell, which is sort of like a Twilight Zone-ish, Tales from the Crypt-ish story that really is, after his success in Hollywood, is kind of a more kind of down and dirty style horror movie, or even kind of his more sedate horror movies like The Gift, which I think is a very well acted and very interesting movie written by Billy Bob Thornton. But I mean, again, these are genres that you don't really dip into, but I do think that if you at least want to get some background on 1980s horror films, the sort of independent movement that was going on in the very early 80s, you can probably gain an appreciation even now going back to the original Evil Dead.
I mean, even I, with no great love of the sort of the horror genre, appreciate that film's position as a sort of very influential sort of touchstone movie. So I probably should, just for I don't know, guess my film education, I should go back and watch that film at the very least. So
there's also one other film that has gotten a bit more attention in recent years, maybe just because of the, at this point, all-star cast, is his spaghetti western tribute, The Quick and the Dead, from the mid to late 90s, which has Sharon Stone and Russell Crowe and Leonardo DiCaprio and Gene Hackman. Really a cast that even at the time was extremely impressive. And even though it's very much a ridiculous movie, you basically have Gene Hackman playing a slightly darker version of his character from Unforgiven. If you have interest in westerns, hey, not likely to have an exploding helicopter there, but as someone who, as another genre that they really love, which is westerns, it's a film that I think is very worthwhile, and again, really shows off some of that extreme visual style that he brings to the movies.
Well, I can definitely do westerns, so I think that might be the first stop that I make. But the next stop we're making on this podcast is getting stuck into Darkman. So before we do that, let's hear Trailer Man do his thing.
They destroyed everything he had, all that he loved, everything that he was. Now, crime has a new enemy, and justice has a brand new face.
I was afraid that you wouldn't want me anymore.
Of course I still want you.
The good news is that I know who's behind our little troubles of late. Finish it.
He has the power to look like any man.
They're still both sons of witches!
But he is unlike any man.
I gotta tell you something about me. He's a cockroach. You think you're killing? And he pops up someplace else.
In the darkest hour,
Julie, who's the real monster here?
there's a light that shines on every human being. But one. From director Sam Raimi. Darkman.
Scientist Peyton Westlake is brutally attacked, disfigured, and left for dead by ruthless mobster Robert Durant. The corrupt criminal had been trying to cover up a dodgy property deal that had been unearthed by Peyton's girlfriend. Westlake is given an experimental treatment for his injuries, which leaves him unable to feel pain or control his emotions. With the world believing him to be dead, Westlake continues his work, which conveniently involves creating synthetic skin with the aim of hunting down the men responsible for his attack. In the cast for this, we have Liam Neeson, Frances McDormand, Jenny Agutter, and Larry Drake. More fondly remembered probably by older listeners as Benny from LA Law. There are also some cameos for Bruce Campbell and John Landis. The film was written and directed by Sam Raimi, although there are actually quite a few sort of writing credits on this film, which too many to list, so we'll just go with that. Darkman has a 59% rating on Rotten Tomatoes and a 64% rating on IMDb. The critics seem to be a bit warmer on this film than those numbers suggest. From what I can see, this film does appear to have been something of a modest success on its release, at least doubling its money in the United States alone, and it was successful enough for the studio to try to get a Darkman TV series off the ground after this came out. And then in the mid-90s, we got a couple of DTV sequels. So, Doug, with all of that out of the way, what do you have to say about Darkman?
I mean, I think it's still a worthwhile movie. It really is reflective of that era of pulp and superhero filmmaking. It kind of straddles a line between the two. For anyone who was alive in that time period or was watching a lot of films, I think I already mentioned the Tim Burton Batman movie, but also the Warren Beatty Dick Tracy movie, which was certainly in that style as well. But just a few years after Darkman came out, there would be adaptations of The Phantom and The Shadow, the very movie that Sam Raimi was hoping that he was going to make. And actually, strangely enough, The Phantom, which Bruce Campbell was almost the star of. So it really is an era where there still is a sense of unsurety about superhero films in general. It'd be a few years before that would kind of kick into high gear, but this is a filmmaker basically doing a proof of concept of what he could do if given the reins on a superhero property, except with a completely, really fairly original concept. And I do think that it works very well outside of some shaky special effects. I watched this film with my wife, who has very little interest in, you have little interest in superhero movies and horror movies. Well, she has little interest in superhero movies, horror movies, any other genre that isn't perhaps a documentary. And she was less than enthused and found some of the shaky blue screen in particular to be pretty ridiculous. And I remember even watching it in the early 90s and thinking that it looked pretty rough around the edges in regards to that. But, generally this is comparative to movies like Dick Tracy and Batman, a fairly low budget affair. The names Liam Neeson and Frances McDormand didn't mean as much in 1990 as they would just a few years later. So I do think it's a movie that holds up, I think, pretty well. It feels, again, very much of its era, but I do think that in particular, Liam Neeson gives a great unhinged performance as Darkman. It's hard to think of Liam Neeson, the once respected actor and now action star, taking a role where his face is covered for most of the film and has to, really play up his madness. There's two particular sequences I always think of when I think of Darkman. One is when he's frustrated in his lab after the Darkman accident occurs, and he puts a little item on his head and starts dancing around. And he says, "See the dancing freak, pay $5." I love it so much. And then the second is maybe the highlight of the entire movie, which is the carnival sequence in the film, where he is accosted by a carny in his attempts to win a pink elephant for his girlfriend. And because, again, of his unchecked anger because of his accident, he ends up bending the carny's fingers backwards. And then it leads to this amazing visual moment where the camera just is straight on the carny's face screaming, pans to the left of him screaming, pans to the left of Frances McDormand screaming, and then he throws the carny through his kind of carnival tent. Just an amazing moment, which ends with like another carnival barker just saying the word freak over and over and over again, just in case we didn't get a sense of what Peyton Westlake's biggest concern is regarding his accident.
Well, you've sort of moved us onto one of the issues that I had with this film. And, well, I don't know if I really had an issue with it, but I'm certain I'm not actually quite clear in my own mind quite what I make of it, which is I guess it's the tone of this film, because
absolutely
it is a very dark story that we've got here. So Peyton Westlake is that Liam Neeson's character is basically out on a mission of personal vengeance, and in executing that kind of particular plan, he really, as we've already said, he becomes the monster inside that he is, or that he feels that he is on the outside. And yet within the film, so it has this tragic arc, which kind of goes back to many classic films or even classic literature. This kind of very sort of tragic arc for that character, but within this dark story, you still have these moments of absurd comedy or absurd violence, and I'm not sure it necessarily always meshed. I think there are some moments within the film where it really works, but there were some moments, and actually the one at the carnival, where I don't necessarily feel that it completely works. That camera shot you described is fantastic, but sort of Liam Neeson sort of freaking out about the fact that he can't get this pink elephant, it kind of follows this, quite sort of emotive scene that he's having with his girlfriend, and how that all meshed together. I wasn't quite convinced that it really necessarily worked at that moment. So is that me? Is that me sort of projecting onto this film a tone that it's not trying to do, and me just wanting something that's more traditional? Am I not getting the Sam Raimi vibe? I mean, how should I read these particular moments?
No, I think you're absolutely right. The tonal whiplash is absolutely in effect here. There are scenes that are played extremely seriously and very straight, and then there's a counterpoint to that scene almost always, where characters are collecting fingers and and having wild outbursts. I do think that is the struggle that Sam Raimi in particular is having with trying to make a commercial product while still keeping his own interest in check. It's something he obviously got a lot better at when he started to make the Spider-Man movies years later. There are sequences in Spider-Man 2 which are just as visually wild as the sequences in Darkman, but I think they mesh better with perhaps the lighter tone of those movies. This movie, because of its kind of, we talked about the kind of the pulp origins, the shadow, that sort of thing. But also this movie is steeped very much in kind of universal monster movies. Kind of the slightly sympathetic monster at its core is Darkman himself. But the fact that we have to care about Peyton Westlake's relationship with Julie Hastings, Frances McDormand's character, and him trying to kind of regain his life, I think it's clear right from the beginning of the movie, well, not right from the beginning, but certainly from his accident, that simply just isn't going to happen. And his realization takes pretty much the entire movie to get to that point. So I think it's trying to cater to a lot of audiences, which makes some of those tonal issues a little bit more overt. That said, it is a movie I think that you have to kind of give yourself over to, because even in those serious moments, I find that Liam Neeson is playing a very pitched up, I mean, camp might be too strong of a word, but he really is being ridiculous right from the beginning. I mean, even the idea that as a scientist, he's they're trying to break this barrier, but he has this like Japanese assistant who, when they get accosted, the Japanese assistant jumps back and tries to do like a karate pose for a second. I know we're going to talk about the comic adaptation in just a few minutes, but I do have to say one of the striking things about the original script of this movie and the comic adaptation is that his assistant is as potentially offensive as him doing that karate pose is. It's a lot more offensive how he was written originally.
Well, you've spoken about some of the sort of the touchstone movies or touchstone pieces of literature. So, as you said, things like the old 30s Universal horror movies are definite touchstones for the tone that Raimi's trying to hit here, and that's apparent right up at the front of the film, where the old Universal studio logo, we see that used at the beginning of the film. And characters like Phantom of the Opera, Hunchback of Notre Dame, those type of tragic monsters are definitely influences here. And I thought that was quite interesting, because obviously Darkman is really one of these films that came out really at the start of the sort of superhero boom. It came out just after the Batman movie. Obviously, Darkman must have been, in production, at the same time as Batman. And I think what was quite interesting is how much, that Batman film, Dick Tracy, and things like Darkman are harking back to the sort of the 1940s rather than something that's maybe more contemporary, because of all of these comic book characters continued on in the 50s, the 60s, the 70s, and the 80s. And I don't know if you've got any particular insight as to why that was seen as the sort of the pot of influences to draw from, rather than making something that maybe doesn't have any context, or maybe one that's more up to date.
It is interesting. I always think about how strange it was that the original, well, not the original, but the late 70s Superman film with Christopher Reeve, it didn't really spark a series of superhero movies, mostly because the cost of that movie was prohibitive to almost every other studio, right? It just was a very expensive proposition. It took more than a decade for them to finally make a Batman movie, despite the, not just one success, but even sequel successes to that superhero movie, Superman movie, I should say. So the idea that when Tim Burton was making his film, he was looking back to that kind of Art Deco style of the 1940s, one that would be continued off with the animated series of Batman. I mean, I do think that he is the one that sort of dictated that style, and maybe it was just something that he particularly had interest in. You can see hints of it in Edward Scissorhands and some of the work that he did before. I think it's just because of the striking visual style of it. And Darkman, I think, again, feeds off those same sort of influences. It really is, in some ways, a kind of also-ran, right? I mean, it really is trying to use Batman as a template, even to the fact that Danny Elfman does the score for Darkman, and it sounds very Batman-ish at its core. But in terms of why Tim Burton decided to go in that direction, I guess in some ways it does make his films rather timeless. And I do think that there's an element here of that, at least in the night scenes. It's a little hard to kind of really pinpoint where Darkman is supposed to take place. That it's kind of a mixture of New York City and LA. I think it was mostly filmed in LA and Toronto, so I guess that kind of makes sense. But I do think it's because of the idea of its influences coming from so far in the past that there's an attempt to make things somewhat timeless. But then you have the science aspect on top of it, which dates this movie in a lot of interesting ways. Though I have to say, now that we live in a world with 3D printing, it feels like Darkman is more contemporary than it was even in 1990.
One thing I wanted to ask you about was what you made of the villains in this particular film, because the villains here are really just involved in trying to do a dodgy land deal. So they're not out to, they're not out for world-ending terror or to poison the city's water supply. And the crimes that we see them commit are mostly them attacking other criminals. It's kind of bad on bad. And that left me feeling a little nonplussed about their sort of role in this film. I mean, did the bad guys work for you here?
Well, they did try to blow up Peyton Westlake for no reason at all. There is a suggestion from there that maybe they get into some bad business otherwise. And also in the Chinatown sequence, they do kind of shoot their guns into the crowd indiscriminately, murdering quite a few in the process. So, I mean, you're right. Generally, they are shown to be more interested in dealing with other criminals, but I don't think there's any shortage of them being shown as being bad guys. Maybe the underlings are slightly less colorful and less kind of filled in regards to their badhood, in particular Ted Raimi's character. But I will say that one of the interesting things about Larry Drake's character, Robert G. Durant, that I don't hear mentioned very often is that there is an undercurrent that I didn't pick up on really until a viewing a couple of years ago. I think the one that I was doing for the articles I was writing about the comic adaptation is that Robert G. Durant is supposed to be a gay character, and that he is supposed to be grooming Rick's character, the Ted Raimi character, and that's why we see him take him to the ball and give him a martini, and then we see how upset he is when Rick is apparently leaving with the kind of bald goon on the flight with the 2 tickets, and that's supposed to be kind of an extra layer to his anger in that particular sequence where he throws the gentleman out the window. I never picked up on that. I don't know how I feel about that. I like that it's kind of not on the surface, that it's something that you would have to kind of infer from some of the dialogue and how he reacts to Rick in the movie. But I also kind of feel like it's kind of conflating his homosexuality with his unhinged nature, and that's something that I really don't particularly care for. But there are more than a few dated elements to the movie as a whole, so I guess it kind of just is part of the mix. I do think that the only really standout villain in this is certainly Robert G. Durant. It's strange, we haven't mentioned Louis Strack Jr., the actual full-on villain, kind of Donald Trumpish villain of the movie, and that's because he's kind of a non-entity. I don't think he's a particularly strong performer in this movie. It feels kind of like, and this is with a lot of the actors in the movie, it feels like at least half of his dialogue is dubbed over, probably trying to cover up that Scottish accent of his. But he really isn't. When you come out of this movie, the villain that you think about is Larry Drake. You don't think about Colin Friels in this movie really at all, which is probably kind of a condemnation of the impact that he has on it. Even though I do think that final set piece up in the half constructed building is still pretty impressive.
Yes, and he doesn't really get a lot of screen time, and he certainly doesn't really get many scenes to I guess really establish himself as the power behind the throne here, or being the kind of the true villain of the piece. And that sequence, it's a great sequence on the building site up on those kind of girders there. But I've watched this film twice now, and it always sort of strikes me as like, oh yeah, actually he's the real bad guy of this piece, and it's like that probably shouldn't be how you shouldn't really be a sort of an emotion or thought that you're having at the film's big climax. I think you should probably, by the time you arrive at that point, you should be a lot clearer in your own mind as to who the villain is, and why you want them to see them get their comeuppance.
It's strange because when you see Robert G. Durant destroyed and killed permanently, for sure, never coming back in that helicopter explosion, it feels sort of like the culmination, because that is, I think, a pretty impressive action scene too, with Darkman hanging from the helicopter as it flies through the city. And it just feels like, oh, right, boom, helicopter down. I guess we're done there. Time to kind of clean things up and go home. But then there's like another 15 minutes of this big kind of final action sequence. And yeah, I mean, it's kind of the limitation of having a film where the big bad guy, even though it's revealed that he's into some shady business right from the beginning, that you don't really get a sense of how evil he is until about 3/4 of the way through. So it doesn't get as developed as it does in the original script or in the comic, where there's an initial scene where you see Louis Strack's father die, and then you find out at the end that he was responsible for his own father's death, as well as in the final scene where we find out that he was responsible for his wife's death.
Yeah, and I think there's also some elements that don't quite, some decisions that are made that also don't quite make the reveal of him as the villain really work. Partly to just screen time, but then also, we really sort of find out that he's the mastermind behind it when this coffee-stained memo turns up again on his desk, and that's when the penny drops for Frances McDormand's character. And I don't know. I guess, was that really the best way of doing it? I say not.
You were talking, of course, of the Belisarius Memorandum, which they
should have been the name of the film.
Yeah, I was thinking that several times as well. Look, it's a visual shorthand, certainly, but talk about a guy who is not careful at all. First sending out a memo about his criminal dealings and letting it get out into the public where a lawyer can find it, and then just keeping it on his desk, and him coming out, it's like, I wish you hadn't have seen that. Well, if you wish she hadn't have seen that, maybe put it in a drawer or something. Don't just leave it there with this visible mark on it that would draw her attention to it. Yeah, I mean, I do think that that's particularly silly. It just shows that his a lot of what comes upon him is something that he's brought on himself. I mean, he probably couldn't predict a murderous scientist who can change his face at will, but certainly he was inviting trouble by having that memorandum so available to people who are actively trying to prosecute him.
I dread to think how successful as a criminal he would have been if he had a proper filing system and just a better organized office manager. But
why does that memorandum even exist? I mean, why didn't you just rip it up? Who needs it? I get it, right? You want to toss it to your accountant at the end of the year, but boy, I feel like it's just that's sticking out in a way that could come back and bite you, and boy, it sure did.
Well, let's move on to talking about the comic book adaptation that was made of Darkman. Normally, these types of films start as comic books and then get made into films. But with Darkman, we've got something that actually ended up happening the other way around. You, Doug, have done a deep dive into the comic books that came out after the film, and so I wondered if you could perhaps talk about some of the sort of interesting differences that there are between the film and the subsequent comic books.
The most interesting thing is that the comic book, and this is often the case when there's a comic book adaptation of a movie, is working from the original script as opposed to the final film. It's hard to even know if they had like stills to work from, because certainly the characters in the movie, Larry Drake's character in particular, looks nothing like his character in the film proper. I mean, Darkman, his design did, but obviously that would have been worked out fairly early in the process. But it's working from the original script. And one of the things I was doing in that series of articles was comparing kind of three layers: the original script, the comic book adaptation, and the final film. Now, there's a lot of language differences. Certainly no swearing is included in the comic book. Certainly when the pink elephant is shoved into Francis McDormand's hand, he uses a slightly different word that he uses in the film itself. But there are some kind of stark differences as well. And probably the major one is what happens to the Rick character. In one of the more notable, and certainly one of the sequences that is closest to horror in the film, Darkman pulls Rick underground into a sewer and basically pours water on him until he gets all the information he needs. Then he shoves his head up a manhole with traffic kind of dodging him until eventually one just runs over his head off screen, killing him. In the original script and in the comic book, Darkman hides under his bed, waits for him to get up, and then scares him so much that he loses his mind. Doesn't actually kill him, just scares him so much that he's left wandering in a haze for the rest of the movie, or the rest of the comic book and the original script. So I do think that that the way that they decided to do things in the movies was actually a little bit more effective. But that seemed to have come up, I don't know, with another draft, or maybe even came up with whole cloth. Probably a little easier for Sam Raimi to do that since his brother is the one who was playing Rick in the movie. There's a lot of kind of little differences. As I mentioned, the Japanese assistant is written as a lot more of a stereotype in the original script and in the comic adaptation. There's a lot of sequences that are kind of trimmed down or combined to make things a little more tight and concise. But the biggest difference between the movie and the comic book is the fact that the comic book has a lot more of a restrained visual style. And that is something that I thought was particularly interesting. You would think, the comic book, Sam Raimi being so influenced by comic books and his visual style, really kind of taking from the comics that he obviously loved as a child, since he would go on to make those Spider-Man movies, and now Doctor Strange coming up as well, that it's a really by the numbers visual style for a lot of the comic. There are moments which get very surreal and very interesting, but taking the example of that carnival scene, a scene that in the movie, is completely wild. If tonally it doesn't work for you or not, it still visually is very interesting. When you see Peyton Westlake go mad, if you could say it that way, there's this thing where it kind of goes into his eyeball and you see his basically world explode in anger around him. It's very kind of striking. But in the comic book, it's just he gets angry. He all he does is pick up the guy and throw him. And that's just how it is in the comic as opposed to the movie. So it's kind of interesting. Generally, I would think that the comic book adaptation would be the more visually striking version, because they don't have to worry about budget. They don't have to worry about the time it would take to kind of stage all of these things. But comparatively, it's a much more sedate experience. The one other thing to note is, of course, this movie's called Darkman. But it's not like Liam Neeson goes around in the movie saying, "I am Darkman, I fight evil," that sort of thing. It's just, it's a name that we give to him because he's got to be called something. In the comic, it ends with him, and actually, even when he first arrives at the abandoned factory that's going to be his lab, he kind of screams into the sky, "I am Darkman, like I am vengeance," that sort of thing. It is a little bit more overtly pulp, I think, than how the movie kind of treats that material. It also kind of ends with him fighting crime as Darkman, with the suggestion that, hey, we could have Darkman comics for years if we wanted. And in fact, there are more Darkman comics than just the adaptation. I think there even was a Darkman comic that crossed over with Army of Darkness. It's and maybe even Reanimator, now that I think about it. There's more Darkman material out there, but it is always interesting to kind of poke around into these comic adaptations and see what someone else's interpretation of that same material looks like.
Well, as we've already mentioned, Sam Raimi here is making a sort of superhero type movie at what we now think of as the sort of the modern tidal wave of these movies that we now live through. And then obviously many years later, he's then sort of came back once that was more established as a genre to work on the Spider-Man movies, and he's now obviously working on an upcoming Doctor Strange movie. As you've seen these movies, I mean, what sort of journey has Raimi been on here? Obviously he's now working on these kind of big multi-million type franchises, so you would think that his ability to impose his own sort of personal vision on those movies is somewhat thwarted, presumably by the sort of needs of the studio. So yeah, how does Raimi now work inside of that sort of superhero genre?
I mentioned earlier that this movie is kind of an also-ran in the superhero properties of that time period because it's so obviously influenced by Batman. And it's interesting to think now, looking back, that when Sam Raimi decided to adapt Spider-Man instead, that he was the one breaking new ground, that he was creating the visual style that would kind of define a lot of the superhero movies of that period, for better or for worse. And he was kind of the front runner of that. It's always a little odd to me. Now, kind of notoriously, he made Spider-Man, which was a massive financial and critical success to some extent. Then he made Spider-Man 2, which was even more of a critical success. I mean, people still kind of, again, hold that up as one of the heights of the entire genre. And I do think that it is a very, very strong movie. And then he made a much maligned sequel, Spider-Man 3, where the studio imposed a lot of the decisions on him. And I just think that's so strange. He made two of these massively, kind of two of the most successful movies of all time. And then the studio still had that level of power over him. I still feel like in retrospect, it's a little hard to swallow the idea that he couldn't impose some of his will. But I mean, I guess we still see it at this point where directors, and this was actually an example with Doctor Strange, the movie that he took over from Scott Derrickson, who made the first Doctor Strange film, that if you kind of try to push your vision too hard on Marvel at the moment, and not at the time, I think it was just Sony in the 90s, but Marvel now, that they'll just replace you. That if you're an Edgar Wright and you're trying to make Ant-Man in your vision, that they'll just find someone else to make your script. And so it's probably hard with that massive Disney machine behind it to impose your will. But it is kind of funny to think back that he was the guy, right? Though I guess maybe they're still a little bit gun shy from the direction that the Batman films came in. I mean, I like Batman Returns a lot, but that movie, that's Tim Burton imposing his will on the style. It's like, okay, I'm going to make a Batman movie, and then I'm going to make my Batman movie afterwards. I think people kind of forget with some of the output that Tim Burton has done over the last decade or so that there was a time when he might have been one of the more unique Hollywood fixtures of that early 90s period. But I mean, Sam Raimi has been incredibly successful. He is a massive, huge Hollywood director and producer, and he has been responsible for a lot of strong movies. But I can't help but feel, and this is how I feel about some other directors, Peter Jackson in particular, where I would love to see them kind of rein things back a little and kind of get back to their roots and do things a little bit more simply and a little bit more, down and dirty. And we did see that a little bit with Sam Raimi returning to the genre with Down to Hell, but it's Drag Me to Hell, sorry. But I don't think that's something that we're likely to see a lot of outside of maybe some of his producing practices. There's obviously another Evil Dead film in the works, and there was the Bruce Campbell Evil Dead television show, which Sam Raimi directed the pilot episode of. So, you do get hints of it here and there. You do get the kind of throwbacks to the relationships that he's had in the past. And I guess when it comes right down to it, just kind of going back to the first thing I was talking about in regards to Sam Raimi, one of the things that I think I felt a real kinship with and a lot of kind of affection for in regards to his work is that he worked with a lot of the same people, that he did create these relationships that would carry on, and that there are little jokes for people who are fans of his career that you can kind of see with some of the casting. And that includes in this film, in Darkman, where you see Dan Hicks from Evil Dead 2, who unfortunately passed away earlier this year, as one of he's the goon with the false leg. And you mentioned John Landis appears here. Jenny Agutter obviously shows up briefly in that same sequence, and you also have Scott Spiegel shows up. Obviously, for those who are fans of Sam Raimi, know that he's connected to his career. William Lustig, the director of Maniac Cop, is in here as well. He's not as kind of overt on these cameos as some other directors are, John Landis in particular. But I do like the fact that there's, for people who are particularly interested in his career, that there is kind of small shout outs to having that level of detail and level of interest in his work.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thanks, Doug. We're going to take a quick break, and when we come back, we're going to be looking at the exploding helicopter action.
On the Simplistic Reviews podcast, we talk movies. We talk TV. We talk.
Hello, Julie, what the heck are you doing?
Trying to make our spots sound more exciting by adding explosions.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure you could have got the point across with sound effects, not the real thing. Car.
Download the show on iTunes or at simplisticreviews.blogspot.com.
I'm sure your insurance company will cover that.
No, they won't.
No, they probably won't.
We're back, and now we're looking at the exploding helicopter action. As the film moves towards its climax, Westlake is hunted by Durant, who's in a helicopter. Westlake ends up dangling from a cable on the bottom of the chopper. Meanwhile, a police helicopter turns up, but it's shot out of the sky by Durant using a grenade launcher. This leaves Durant free to finish off Westlake. They try to drop the dangling Darkman in front of some oncoming traffic, but this only allows Westlake to attach the cable to the top of the truck that's conveniently about to enter a tunnel. Unable to gain altitude, the helicopter smashes into the entrance of the tunnel and explodes. So, Doug, what did you make of the exploding helicopter action?
Well, of course, that's the second helicopter explosion. We do have the Robert G. Durant explode another helicopter, a police helicopter that's chasing them before that point. We referred to it slightly before. It is very definitive. It kills off this character that you will never see again, except Robert G. Durant somehow does return in the first straight-to-video Darkman sequel. Hey, they explain it in the movie. You can accept it or not. I think it's a pretty impressive helicopter explosion. I do like that it has that kind of shot from inside the tunnel of Darkman laughing while debris basically is flying all around him. Some shaky special effects perhaps in that particular sequence, but that's par for the course for the movie as a whole. I think that it's hard to put a capper on that action sequence, which I have already said I think is very impressive. The sequence where Darkman is hanging from that hook, there's some pretty impressive stunt work involved there. There's obviously a real person at the end of that hook at some point. When they did the video game adaptation of Darkman, there's no hook at all. It's just Darkman hanging from a rope. So they decided to up the difficulty a little bit as he's dodging traffic in that particular version. But no, I like it. I think maybe the model work with the helicopter probably could be a little bit better. But I imagine in terms of the helicopters that you've seen explode, shaky model work is probably par for the course. Yeah,
there's I've seen a lot of shaky model work, that's for sure. And I don't know, as I've got older, I find it sort of less and less interesting to really sort of poke holes in special effects unless they're insultingly bad. I think with Darkman they're clearly trying to do a good job, so and they're working within whatever limitations they've got, be it financial or the skill of the people that they're working for. So I kind of obviously I noticed there's some shaky sort of back projection green screen work here, and the sort of the blend of real life vehicles and models is obvious, but I tend to just go with the flow. And certainly, yeah, this is the exploding helicopters we get here are I think are really fantastic, and they come as part of an excellent extended aerial sequence with helicopters here. And the part of the film that precedes the blow-ups with Darkman dangling from that cable is very, very good, and reminded me a bit of Police Story 3 Super
That's
Cop.
right, Jackie Chan doing the same sort of stunt. I wonder if there was any crossover influence there, but yeah, that's certainly the sequence that it reminded me of. Not many people probably willing to hang from a helicopter or hang from, in that sort of situation. I get, it's strange because the final sequence up in the kind of rafters of a building, or the structure of a half completed building, I don't really get a sense in that sequence of the height that is supposed to be taking place. I don't really get that feeling of vertigo and that feeling of kind of fear of heights, but I certainly get it in that helicopter sequence.
But there are a couple of details here in this particular sequence that I really liked, I do like a nice payoff line, especially if it is associated with an exploding helicopter, and we get a couple here. So when Durant blows up the police helicopter, he pulls out this massive sort of grenade launcher and announces "No more Mr. Nice Guy," which is yeah, but also Liam Neeson gets a nice payoff line here as well when he dispatches Durant. He shouts back at the sort of the wreckage of the helicopter that's cartwheeling down this tunnel. He just yells, "Kiss your ass goodbye," which is a nice sort of little bow on that particular sequence.
I don't know how he's yelling anything without lips, but he makes it work somehow in the movie.
Okay, I think that just about wraps things up for this show. So, Doug, thank you for joining me once again. Do you want to take a moment to tell people about what you get up to online? Maybe not all of it.
Well, I do have a few podcasts. You can find them over at cinemasmorgasbord.com or on Twitter at cinemasmorg, SMORG. That includes the Redux version of Eric Roberts' The Man, missing a unpleasant word there, but if you have interest in that podcast, the work of Eric Roberts or other actors like Jackie Chan, like Carol Kane, like Vic Diaz, like Steve Buscemi, we have podcasts devoted to those actors and many more over at cinemasmorgasbord.com. I also do a podcast about shot on video cinema called No Budget Nightmares at nobudgetpodcast.com. Or if you just want to check out what I'm up to, follow me on Twitter at Doug_Tilley. That's TILLEY.
As always, don't forget to check out the Exploding Helicopter website for reviews of films where helicopters explode. If you can help spread the word about what we do, I'd be very grateful. We rely on word of mouth. We'll be back soon, but until then, keep watching the skies for those exploding helicopters.
This podcast is a proud member of the Lamb Podcasting Network. Find the network at largeassmovieblogs.com.
What am I? Some kind of a circus freak? Is that it? Is that it? Some kind of a freak? Maybe I should be wearing a funny little hat. Do you like it? Yeah? Yeah? See the dancing freak. Pay $5 to see the dancing freak. Only $5 to see the dancing